The name Gorbey is derived from the French word corveau, crow, and it was the French-Canadian lumbermen of New England who first whispered it was bad luck to injure or drive away a Gorbey. Because although it looks like an ordinary bird, a Gorbey may actually be the soul of a lumberman in ornithomorphic or bird-like form. The risk of harming this innocent-seeming bird is shown in a story about a logging camp foreman named Esau. Esau was a large, brutally strong man who ruled over the other loggers by fear. He had copious amounts of hair on his head, chin, and body, and told the other loggers his hair was a sign of his great strength. Needless to say, everyone in the camp hated his guts. One snowy winter night, a small Gorbey flew into the bunkhouse. The loggers refused to harm the bird, thinking it might be the soul of a friend who had died. Esau laughed and called them superstitious. Catching the gray bird in one giant hairy hand, he said, "This bird has the eyes of Frenchy O'Coin, who died a few weeks ago. I didn't like him when he was alive, and I like him even less now that he is dead." With a brutish laugh, Esau plucked the feathers from the bird's body and tossed it out of the window into the storm. The other men looked on with fear, but didn't intervene. When Esau awoke the next morning, he was horrified to see that his head, chin, and body were completely hairless. His great strength was gone as well. The other loggers were also freaked out and knew his transformation was caused by his cruelty to the Gorbey. Worried his supernatural misfortune might be contagious, they forced him out into the snow. Esau was never able to work at another lumber camp and eventually got a job catching stray horses. No man ever shared a table or roof with him again, and Esau was always followed by storms for the remainder of his cursed life. Hello, my name is Ian. And today we're talking about Edward D. Ives, known almost universally as Sandy Ives, and his article, "The Man Who Plucked the Gorbey, a Maine Woods Legend." This is from 1961. Ives was a critical figure in folklore studies in general and Atlantic Canadian folklore studies. And then you might be wondering, why is that the case, considering considering he's talking about Maine? And a point that he actually gets to, and will be one of the most important points of his life, fundamentally, is that when we are talking about region, we want to remind ourselves that the regions that are imposed from without, in terms of international borders and so on, are not necessarily hard and fast. Sometimes they are accidents, and we have borders that are that go across the lands of people. So we can think about the American southern border, which sort of traverses traditional lands. We can certainly think about that with various political borders or provincial borders and First Nations groups. Or we can also remember, we don't have to necessarily think of it as a within that framework of brutality and colonialism. We can just remind ourselves that these borders were somewhat arbitrary and fluid. And Ives' life's work was basically focused on the Maine woods. He went up to Maine in the early 1950s with a master's degree in English, and he was teaching introductory English courses. But while there, he had spent a year in New York, and he was interested in the burgeoning folk music scene there. And he was singing folk songs and that kind, because he had a nice voice and he knew the guitar, and that's what people did in the 1950s. So then when he went to Maine, he started singing there, and he started listening to others singing, and he became fascinated with the songs that were about the Maine woods. And he would actually sometimes, because university professors aren't paid nearly as much as they deserve, sometimes he would actually earn a little extra money as a folk singer and go on little tours and so on, especially in the summer. And lo and behold, as he was encountering these songs, he's learning them, and he was learning how to, learning the repertoire and learning the local expectations of what people wanted from their folk singers. He kept on hearing the name associated with the composer. His name was Larry Gorman in particular. So many of these songs were purportedly written by this guy called Larry Gorman. Now Ives was trained in, from that English perspective, the idea that folk song is written by the horde, written by the crowd, written by the indistinguished folk, and that there is no artist, there is no writer. And he was realizing that that is not the case. That at the very least in this, because not only did you have the name associated with him, you had stories about this songwriter. And so he started a more in-depth study of Larry Gorman. And by doing so, he shifted his attention from the texts to the actual singers and the actual composers and the actual contexts for singing. And that was quite a revelation. Then he presented his material at American Folklore Society meeting. He was invited to do his PhD at Indiana, and then he went back to Maine and basically created the study of folklore in Maine. But Larry Gorman was from Prince Edward Island originally, and the movement of Maritimers to Maine and Mainers to Maritimers, and then the movement of their songs as well, is one of the things that Ives identified. He later talks about how Maine and the Maritimes is one fabric. That yes, there are local distinctions as well, but because of the interactions, because of the more or less permeability of the border, and the itinerancy of work, and certainly seasonal work, and the seasonal work of the lumber camps, you can treat it all as basically one place, or at least your study can't end at its border, at the international border, because that is not how the folk fundamentally operate. I mean, I was raised at the border of two provinces, and yes, clearly there was Ontario and Quebec differences, but then there was the greater Ottawa Valley region, and you can't distinguish between the two. There's this permeability. Even in the late 20th century, when you had different laws and different codes and different taxes and different language expectations and so on, still it was a region that you needed to, was overlapped on the many other ways that you could examine that geographic place, or a geographic space. It's a space and place argument. Now, for the most part, Ives was interested in song, and his great contributions are to song. He did the biography of Larry Gorman, he did one on Joe Scott, and did one on Lawrence Doyle. And this deep biographies based on whatever archival research he could come up with, and interviews with people who actually knew him, and so on, that gave understanding of the songs that they composed, and also then once you got an understanding of the songs that they composed, then the understanding of how those songs entered into a tradition, not literally, not only literally in terms of how they went from this songwriter into the repertoire, but how they continue to be sung because they are of continuing relevance, whether they are continuing relevance because of their topicality, or whether they are of continuing relevance because they continue to meet the aesthetic expectations of the group. And that group is defined not simply in terms of the Maine woodsmen, which were sort of the nexus of much of this material, but radiating out, and the general experience of what? Working, the general experience of the Western Atlantic, general experience of etc. But local song expectations for what makes a song. But this is not about song. This is about a legend. This is about a legend of a little bird called a Gorbey, sometimes called a gray jay. And so it's I have it written here, and I'm going to, I presume, butcher the pronunciation. Michcoquedge, or the Parasaurus canadensis. I love it when the Latin names are repeated. Anyway, it's a tiny little gray bird. It's an adorable little thing, a gray jay. It was actually nominated in 2017 to be Canada's national bird by the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. And it is everywhere. If you see its patterns of its sort of natural territory, it's almost coterminous with all of Canada. It ventures into the northeast of the United States. Actually, there's this interesting little strip that goes down the Rockies and so actually touches northern New Mexico. But for the most part, it is a Canadian bird. Apart from the very, very far north, it is ubiquitous. And it's small, and it's cute, and it's lovely, and it's fuzzy, and it's very tame, and it was a feature of the Maine woods. And it would eat anything. It would come down. It would devour food, and it wasn't afraid of lumbermen, and it wasn't afraid of people at all. So they'd be on tables. They'd be like sometimes like would land on your knee. You could feed them. It would steal food. There's this great story he talks about where Jay, it's like, oh, this big, and they pull dashes off with 3 donuts. One in each claw, and then one in his beak. And it's just like, I don't know. I ran out of hands in order to do the flapping, so because I can't grab donuts with my legs. But anyway, just sort of flying away. And I don't really care if that happened or not. That's an image, and not really caring what happened or not is, some ways the basis of legend, because the version that I just read from you was actually from a website from 2010. It doesn't appear in his article, and it's a retelling. And we want to remind ourselves that these stories get retold. They get taken from various sources. People feel free to add additional aspects to them because they are interesting, relevant, cool. That is a legitimate adjective to describe why someone will tell a story again, because the story is cool. So from that website, someone thought this was a cool story, and I'm going to retell it again. So legends are these narratives that hover somewhere between truth and not lie, but fiction, somewhere in that area. They are grounded in a certain credibility, and they're grounded in a particular familiarity. They nevertheless test the limits of credibility. And basically, you need to sort of make, in a way, you need to make a concession to an item of contestable worldview in order for you to accept it or not accept it. We can speak of contemporary legends in terms of the alligators in the sewers. We can speak of ideological legends in terms of how landscape came to be. A legend can also be sort of reframed over time, and that it might be considered to have actually happened at one point, and then it retains its weight long after we have a different understanding. It retains its value because, again, A, it's a cool story, or B, it indicates something. I'm thinking of the legend of, in terms of origin legends, why there's a cross on the back of a donkey. Well, during the Easter week, when Jesus entered Jerusalem, he was riding on a donkey, and ever since then there's been a cross on the donkey's back. It's like, that's not how it happened, but I know why people tell it that way, because it continues to be important and resonant, and it fits into a larger sacred narrative. It fits into a mythic understanding, a narrative that is, unlike legend, the possibility for disbelief is that much bigger because it has to do with the intervention of supernatural forces and sort of incredible events that nevertheless we affirm actually happened. And so we have this mythic imagination already, and then the legend just sort of fits in with that because these sorts of things happen, at least around this dude. So it can be retold. But so the legend has to do, as the version I read, had to do with a man. In this version, the one I read from their website, it's a guy called Esau, which does not appear in Ives' work. But some kind of irascible person who took one of these Gorbeys, these innocent, fun birds who might be the souls of dead lumbermen. Who knows? And again, the belief of whether the lumbermen actually believed that the Gorbeys were the souls of dead lumbermen or not, it doesn't matter. It was a belief that existed enough to be uttered if not necessarily to be actually believed, but it becomes a unit of understanding that can then be upon which narratives can be built. Gary Butler calls these ideas traditums. They're beliefs that aren't necessarily believed, but they just become these nice little pieces that from which narratives can be constructed. And so the version that Ives collected had to do with, or what was his name? The most common one, Archie Stackhouse. And so the story was related to this person, Archie Stackhouse, grabbed a bird, plucked it, because he's a irascible type. So there you go. Go get lost with you. Probably a swear or two. Go away. And he woke up the next morning and he was completely bald. And then there's basically some kind of a mixture of homeopathic magic, acts upon like. So you do it to this and this, and also kind of karmic retribution. What you do upon yourself, what you do upon an innocent thing, will be done upon you as well. And there are variations of that, because the first he collected, and they mostly had to do with Stackhouse, and then Ives. And that was based on his fieldwork, and then he expanded through letters in local newspapers, as many of the local newspapers throughout the Maritimes and Maine that he could, and then also some national newspapers. You ever hear about this? What happened in the woods? Someone plucks a bird, and there are consequences. And he got a number of different variations, most of them from Atlantic Canada. In fact, most of them the tellers were from Atlantic Canada. And the events took place either in Maine or in New Brunswick, and he breaks them up into 6 large zones. And it wasn't always Archie Stackhouse. As you go from zone to zone, it's a different person. And so you have this narrative that seems to correlate a person, a known person, presumably a known and named person, and presumably a known and named bald person, and maybe a known and named unpleasant person, that does an act that is, on one level, unconscionable, but I don't know. I mean, it really depends on what one feels about animals. Is it mild? Have you doomed this Gorbey to death? I do not know. Is it an inconvenience? Whatever it is, after a while, the Gorbey drops out of the picture in terms of we don't care about, we probably do because we're nice people, but the narration doesn't care about the fate of the Gorbey. The narration cares about the fate of the person who plucked the Gorbey, the man who plucked the Gorbey. And there is some vengeance put upon them. There are variants. One breaks the wing of the Gorbey, and the next day he in turn has his leg broken, or his arm broken, or his wrist shattered, or something. So, but basically, again, it's this like upon like, and it's spread throughout these communities that are all about lumbermen. I mean, all these communities are lumbering communities, and so you have a narrative that fits. So unlike other articles, or unlike earlier articles in the study of Atlantic Canada, you have what Ives is doing is he's taking one thing, and he is interested first and foremost in variations. He hasn't found a whole bunch of variations. Well, he hasn't found one thing, thought it was cool, and just presented it. Or one thing in one version, and just presented it. He found one thing in his encounters. He found one thing that he then found over and over again with slight variations, but always with this person. And well, what do we have here? And then he expanded his search and found this general structure of a thing. A narrative that didn't have much in the way of parallels in the standard reference works. There's no motif index entry in terms of having to do with plucking a bird. There's it's not in sort of the standard tale types. There's a couple of analogs, but it doesn't seem like, I mean, the analog seems to be the like upon like, which is almost a universal, as opposed to a specific, oh yes, well, someone plucked a bird in this area, and so this is just a transformation of this legend. So he presents this, I want to say incomplete, but that isn't the sense, because this is an exhaustive study where he basically takes it and takes it apart as much as he can. But he doesn't express definitiveness. He is not saying this ultimately is the version of of this legend as is found in either Maine or in the Maritimes. He is saying, here is a narrative that is in some kind of active circulation. Here are its bare bones. Here are its variations. Here are possible explanations on how it came to be. Here are some of the explanatory background information on why it had that understanding, why it had that resonance with the tellers. Here are some things that might explain its unusual names. The Gorbey is not a... Gorbey is a regional term for this bird. It doesn't necessarily extend beyond New England and the Maritimes. Most other places it is the gray jay, and he traces that. And again, in this website, it's immediately attributed to the French Gorbey for crow. And Ives thinks it has to do much more with the Scots word gorb for like a little sort of scavenger type hog, like someone who feeds themselves all the time. And a glutton, I guess, and that it's the actual sort of affinity for eating, just eating everything. Its voraciousness was identified by Scots immigrants at one point, and then the one of the things that gives is an interesting reciprocity in that the name becomes associated with the bird, becomes associated with the plucking the bird legend. The legend spreads, the legend gets retold. Again, not because of belief 100%, although we can always venture back into the issue of belief. We can always venture back into the issue of that there's fundamentally there's a moral associated with it. But it's almost a fable of sorts. But it gets retold, and as it's told with that name for that bird, and then that name for that bird becomes part of the local vernacular expression for these birds. It becomes the vocabulary. That's kind of cool. But what he's fundamentally doing at this point is he is bringing the insights that have finally been developing in folklore studies, and he's bringing it to Atlantic Canada, and he's not looking at these texts as independent of the tellers. That has already started to happen. Helen Creighton was bringing in that insight a little bit. McEdward Leach was bringing in that insight a little bit, although he hadn't really published anything from his work in Atlantic Canada. Slowly, this was happening, and what Ives was doing, and others were doing it elsewhere, but Ives was doing it here, which is why we're talking about Ives. What Ives was doing is like, no, these don't exist without the lives of the tellers. These don't exist without the contexts of performance. These don't exist without the ongoing rationale in the minds of the performers and the audiences of those performers for it to be retold. And that's the shift. So to understand a thing, you have to understand the lives of the people who tell it. That should be obvious, and it's obvious now. But it's obvious now because that is something that we have inherited as an intellectual understanding. That was revelatory at the time. And Ives is the person who more or less began to approach Atlantic Canadian folklore with that in mind. That the lives of the people who tell them are fundamental. So we could do this through song, and he was doing this as well. But I think that one of the things about this is that it's so very discreet. It's a self-contained narrative. It's also a nice short reading. So I'm going to stop there. Edward Ives is a pivotal figure. He later went on to literally write the book about how to do fieldwork interviews. His book, The Tape-Recorded Interview, was more or less the standard reference for the better part of 25 years in terms of not everything from how a tape recorder works, how to ask questions, how to establish rapport, how to do transcriptions, how to archive. It's the first edition. He was still using reels. The second edition had moved to the cassette tape, basically we can still reference it. It ceases to be, once we enter the age of digital recording, it's of less utility. Certainly some of the practical matters are of less utility, but it is still, it has informed fieldwork research for almost 40, 50 years. So, and as you read his stuff, as you read this, and if you read his books, he also wrote so well. He evoked and he personalized the people that he was studying and the contexts that he was presenting. So just a wonderful writer, which is, you don't always get. You do not always get that. Anyway, I'm going to stop, as I said. This is Edward Ives' 1961 article, The Man Who Plucked the Gorbey, a Maine Woods Legend. I wish you absolutely nothing but the best. Please be well and take care of yourselves. Bye.